Okay, look, before you at me, Trese is anime. Netflix classifies it as an anime, so it's anime. It counts, alright? It counts, okay? What is Trese? Trese is a Netflix original anime series based on a series of Filipino comics by Budget Tan and Cajo Baldissimo. It involves the titular Alexandra Trese, the Babaylan Mandarigma of Manila, essentially acting as a go-between and peacekeeper for the human world and the magical underworld. Trese inherited her position from her father at a young age, and struggles to prove her worth against the otherworldly factions who want to use her father's demise to their advantage. But thankfully, she has the support of her adopted brothers, the Kambal, her family friend Hank, and an assortment of other allies, supernatural and otherwise. The first season of the show starts out with a series of mysteries that Trese aids the Manila police in solving. But as the story progresses, it turns out that there may be something more behind all these seemingly isolated supernatural incidents. What could it be? Well, Trese better figure out quick before a full-blown war breaks out between the human and magical worlds. How does the world of Trese work? On the surface, Trese seems like a pretty standard urban fantasy occult detective story, with its main distinguishing feature being that, instead of being set in any town USA, it's set in Manila. And I think that if you are a fan of the occult detective genre, you will see a lot of familiar tropes and ideas presented with a neat, uniquely Filipino twist. The Aswang are essentially vampires, there's an episode with zombies, and haunting ghosts are just as much a thing in the Philippines as they are in the rest of the world. Even with distinctly Filipino monsters, though, you get to see the clever ways in which their existences are incorporated into the modern world. For instance, Trese can summon a San Telmo with her cell phone, and Nunos no longer live under mounds of dirt, but manhole covers. Of course, this alone reveals something about Trese that sets it apart from standard urban fantasy fare. While most American urban fantasy is set in Anytown, USA, the very idea of Anytown, USA is a distinctly political concept that stems from a specific history. The Philippines, though, have a history pretty distinct from America. Like America, there was a vast and diverse array of different peoples and nations and cultures before European colonization. However, since the Philippines were part of the Old World, and more specifically Southeast Asia, the native populace was not as decimated by foreign disease as the Americas were, and there were even traces of Buddhism and Islam long before 1521, when Magellan first claimed the islands for Spain. So this basically meant that the Spanish couldn't simply kill off all the natives with smallpox blankets and round up the survivors into reservations. Instead, you have a mishmash of various peoples and cultures mingled together in a single country at varying levels of social stratification, with new additions to the melting pot through immigration, like with the Chinese, and changing colonial hands, like with the British, Americans, and Japanese. Now, here in America, even if we like to pretend that the Indians all died out, we do still have a pretty diverse population. You have Black Americans, Latin Americans, Asian Americans, and you can even sometimes see them on TV. However, when it comes to urban fantasy, media tends to be a little less diverse. Why is this? Well, my theory is that it has to do with how urban spaces are conceived in the popular American consciousness, with this conception influencing urban fantasy genre conventions. Just as J.R.R. Tolkien set the bar for how high fantasy is conceived, with every high fantasy author after him putting their own spin on the tropes he codified, most of what we associate with urban fantasy comes from Laurel K. Hamilton and her Anita Blake series. There were, of course, predecessors to Hamilton, especially if you classify urban fantasy as simply any fantasy set in the time and world that it was written, but the basic setup that many urban fantasy stories runs with stems from her. This would be a human or near-human protagonist based in a specific city in our world who gets involved in the affairs of supernatural beings who also live in the city and have their own community, living alongside humans at varying levels of secrecy. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the Dresden Files, the Hollow series, even things like Twilight or Supernatural. Even if they were not directly influenced by Anita Blake or have some key differences in their premises, we classify these works under the umbrella term of urban fantasy largely because they use a lot of the tropes that Hamilton created or codified. And it's one of these tropes that I wanted to pay particular attention to, given how it's handled in Trese. See, there's this trend in urban fantasy to tie the magical otherworld to the criminal underworld. It's not simply that monsters exist in our world, but that they're organized and part of a global network of power. Slayers like Buffy and hunters like Anita then are like cowboy cops, killing monsters Texas Justice style because they aren't really people, so it's no big deal. Of course, if your conception of the police and criminals is a little more complicated than good normal people under siege by bad deviant people who need to be put down in the name of public good, then this portrayal might ring a little hollow. This is all compounded by the fact that social trends and movements such as the war on drugs, urban decay, and the white flight still affect how most Americans regard cities to this day. Even if it's been a while since Robert Moses' redlining efforts and Rudy Giuliani's urban renewal policies, the popular image of cities as wretched hives of crime, poverty, and drugs is still one held by many in this country. I think I'm being unfair? Well then, if I mention the cities of Detroit or New Jersey, what image comes to your mind?
Take him to Detroit.
No! No, not Detroit! No! No, please! Anything but that! No!
With that in mind then, heroes like Anita Blake are essentially like Milwaukee Police Chief David Clarke or LA Police Chief Daryl Gates, figures who position themselves as defenders of good and slayers of evil, and who can always tell the clear difference between the two.
Well, let me tell you, people, we have a war, a shooting war. Not in the Middle East right now. We have it on the streets of every major city in this country.
Of course, since the 90s, when Anita Blake was first conceived, this legacy of war mentality policing, and of figures like Daryl Gates, Rudy Giuliani, and Robert Moses, have come under greater scrutiny, and their reputations are much more controversial now than they were at their respective heydays. Despite this, though, you still see in urban fantasy this trend of the protagonist reflecting the beliefs and values of predominantly white suburbs, while non-European magic or beings tend to be portrayed as villainous or not given as much focus. You might run across a magical Native American who will help our heroes stop the awakened forces of an Indian burial ground, and our heroes might go to Chinatown for a mystery or two, but it's much rarer to find a Native American or Chinese American protagonist in urban fantasy. As with our popular conception of cities themselves, civilization in urban fantasy is defined as distinctly Anglo-European, with anyone outside that sphere being presented neutrally or antagonistically. The Philippines are, of course, far from a truly integrated and multicultural society, as one can see from the separatist movements in the south, but the presence of syncretic beings like San Telmo and Trese using magical techniques from both Euro-Catholic and indigenous Tagalog traditions does make the show stand out. You want to know something funny? The urban fantasy trope of vampire courts is almost identical to the conspiracy theory of blood libel or the satanic panic, with a shadowy cabal of nefarious elites pulling the strings on world events and feeding on the blood of unprotected children. And since this elite status is inherent to their race or belief system, rather than a product of wealth and power, the proposed solution to dealing with these people is to kill or imprison them all on sight, regardless of how much actual wealth and power they possess. It doesn't matter if you're a recently turned vampire on your own or a 1,000-year-old vampire monarch. In most urban fantasy fiction, a vampire is a vampire, and those people shouldn't have the same rights as us good and normal folks. Now, I should make very, very clear that I do not think that Laurel K. Hamilton or any of the authors who followed in her footsteps are themselves anti-Semites or secret bigots. I don't know them, and unless they've been using their wealth and fame to actively campaign anti-Semitic movements and causes, I don't really care what their personal politics are. However, I am saying that if you are aware of the blood libel conspiracy theory or the satanic panic, and subsequently of the violent pogroms and propaganda campaigns made against real-life Jews, Satanists, and various other social outsiders, then watching an urban fantasy protagonist mow down vampires and other monsters en masse can seem a little unsettling. And this is especially noticeable because, while high fantasy calls upon some ye olden time that never really was, urban fantasy is supposed to be about the world we live in now. Yet, the urban fantasy genre doesn't seem that interested in reevaluating or re-examining the conventions Laurel K. Hamilton developed, despite the fact that it's been almost 30 years since she first wrote Guilty Pleasures. Like it or not, the world has changed since then. Maybe not by much, but enough that simply recreating the tropes Hamilton developed can seem somewhat out of touch with the current zeitgeist. This is what I want to focus on when discussing Trese, because at first, the show looks like it's delivering a Filipino variant of this Hamiltonian template. Yes, I just used Hamiltonian as a word. Deal with it. The first episode is about a secret cabal of Aswang feeding on children just like with blood libel. The second episode has a tikbalang tied to criminal street racing. And the third episode involves a tiyanak summoned partially because a woman wanted an abortion, which remains illegal in the Philippines. However, with the fourth episode, things start to shift. To explain in full how drastically they shift, I will have to head into spoiler territory, so if you don't want to go there, then skip over to here. But for the rest of you, in episode 4, we see two police officers assaulting a drunken suspect and Chief Guerrero, Trese's friend in the force, berating them for abusing their power. This is unusual because up to this point, Guerrero was our main representative of the Manila Police Department, and because he was presented as a good and noble person, the implication was that the MPD was also inherently good and noble. With this episode though, it turns out that Guerrero is the exception rather than the rule of how MPD officers behave in the Trese universe. Then, in the fifth episode, the tikbalang street racer who is presented as a stereotypical criminal thug comes back as a much more nuanced character. Someone who is rash and hot-headed, but still has a sense of honor and duty, and who becomes an ally to Trese as tensions escalate between the humans and magical beings. From that point on, rather than a defender of the good and normal people against the bad and deviant people, Trese is a peacekeeper, desperately trying to keep the conflict down because things aren't as simple as a black and white good versus evil war. And then, with the season's big reveal, it turns out that the mastermind behind the events of the story was none other than Datu Talag Busao, a war god who wants the conflict between police and criminal, human and magical, to escalate and continue forever, because he quite literally feeds on conflict. So long as the war goes on, Talag Busao only grows stronger. What does Trese have to say? Well, basically, the world can't be easily divided into simple categories of good and evil. This isn't to say that good and evil don't exist, just that if you mark the divide between the two between certain groups of people, all this does is foster conflict and division. The problem as presented by Trese is not that good, normal people are under siege by bad, deviant people, but the war-based mentality itself, that only ends up feeding the war god. Trese's job isn't so much to kill the Aswang or tikbalang or whatnot, but rather to prevent any more killing on either side. Trese is ultimately just one person though, and there's only so much she can do. As such, while the season may end on a more or less upbeat note, what little victory Trese gets is marred by the simple fact that killing one bad guy or 1,000 doesn't stop the war. It's going to take a lot more than a magic knife and some San Telmo summoning to bring peace to Manila. But at the end of the day, that's what the Babaylan Mantarigma is there to do. The thing is, I don't know how in line this portrayal of crime is with the mainstream media portrayal in the Philippines. Especially because, even if that country has had its own war on drugs for almost as long as America, I am sadly far too ignorant of Philippine politics and media to know how similar that war and its popular conception is to America's. I do know, though, that this portrayal is very different from what I have come to expect from the urban fantasy genre. To the point where, even if you have a different viewpoint on the subject, you might also find Trese's going against the grain an intriguing change of pace. Final verdict. At the end of the day, Trese is ultimately an action series, by which I mean its primary concern is simply to have badass heroes and awesome fight scenes with lots of punching and explosions. However, even if Trese is not a very ambitious series, it is at least smart enough to avoid some of the more unfortunate implications that can be found in the urban fantasy genre. While urban fantasy may have its J.R.R. Tolkien with Laurel K. Hamilton, as far as I know, it has yet to find its Terry Pratchett. someone who consciously examines and satirizes the underpinnings of the genre. Still, even if that's the case, as someone hungry to see that urban fantasy Terry Pratchett show up, Trese seems like a step in the right direction to me, for which Season 1 gets a 7 out of 10. I really look forward to Season 2, and I cannot wait to see what happens next. For now though, I'm Marco Keane, signing off, and I hope you liked this video. If you did, and you would like to see me make more, please leave a like or comment down below, share my video via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or other means, and subscribe to my channel. Also, if you would like to help this channel out, I have a Patreon, which you can contribute to via the link in the description. If you sign up, you will get sweet bonuses like an internet hug, early access to videos, and the ability to vote in polls to help me decide which works to cover next. Also, if I manage to get to 250 subscribers by the end of this year, that is 250 YouTube subscribers, by January 1st, 2022, I will play and stream Dragon Quest V for you all. So let's make this happen, people. Please, please, please. Thank you all, and I will see you in the next one.